You're watching the NZ Everyday Investor, and I'm Darcy Ungaro. Today I'm catching up with Ravi Dutta-Powell from Sydney, who leads the Behavioural Insights Team's work on financial markets. In today's show, we're covering nudge economics, save more tomorrow, behavioural economics and its applications in personal finance. It's going to be a good one. Now, there's the ideal and there's the pragmatic. If you have kids, you know what I mean. Ideally, you want to limit their screen time to just 1 hour or less per day, right? But in reality, a healthy dose of continuous Peppa Pig and Star Wars is often just what you need to get through your evening. And it's important that this tension exists between real life and academia, because without a higher degree of thought and analysis and data, additional insights can't be gained, which ultimately handicaps those in the field. On the other hand, without a good understanding of the issues found in the field, researchers can often make insightful discoveries in potentially redundant areas. With economics, there are various schools of thought: the Austrians, Keynesians, neoclassicals, to name just a few, and each framework is useful to a point, but not useful all the time in explaining all things. Take the efficient market hypothesis as an example. Do all investors really have access to all the relevant information they need to base their investment decisions on? And when they do make their decisions, are they really rational decisions? Hertz? Anyone? What I really like about behavioral economics is that it provides potentially a better framework to understand how people make decisions and, more importantly, why. So before we make a start today, if you enjoyed the discussion with Ravi, please be sure to give us a big thumbs up and subscribe to the show. I also want to acknowledge the support of our partner Hatch, who lets you put your money to work in the US share markets. Be sure to have a look at the notes section of this show to find a link for a special offer to our viewers. Now, before we start, remember the usual disclaimer applies here. None of this is to be taken seriously as financial advice, but I do very much hope that it gets you thinking. So I hope you get a lot out of this discussion here with Ravi. Let's make a start. Welcome to the NZ Everyday Investor. I am Darcy Ungaro, and I'm sitting in this virtual studio here with Ravi Dutta-Powell. Thank you for joining us, Ravi.
Thank you for having me.
Cool. Now, Ravi, you lead the Behavioural Insights Team based in Sydney. So tell me, just to start with, what is that? What do you do?
So the Behavioural Insights Team is a company that applies findings from psychology and behavioural economics to public policy. So I lead our work in financial markets and consumer markets. And we actually started out inside government, inside the UK government. As some people might have heard of the nudge unit. So we started in 2010 as an arm of the UK government, but with the mandate to find ways of applying behavioural insights and findings from psychology and behavioural economics to make policies and services better. The idea was that, traditional policy making has a very rigid view of how people behave, and it's not actually that realistic all the time. And so the idea of behavioural insights is that we can use our understanding of human behaviour to make those policies better. There's a lot of interest in that, and actually since 2010 we've spun out and become a company that has offices all over the world. So we have an office in Wellington where we do some work with government and other partners in New Zealand and in Australia and the US, Singapore, a number of other countries.
Fantastic. And so for some of our listeners, they may have heard of terms like neoclassical economics, Keynesian economics, and then we have this branch called behavioral economics. So do you want to just define what is behavioral economics?
Yeah, absolutely. It might actually help to kind of go back to sort of neoclassical economics is perhaps the best starting point. So I'm sure many of your listeners would be sort of familiar with, I guess, at least broadly, the ideas of like an efficient market, and how that's supposed to operate. And traditional economics has a lot of very, very strict assumptions. I've actually studied economics, and so when you actually dig into it, there's like quite strict assumptions about how people behave. In theory, everyone has perfect information about every product on the market. They know everyone's preferences, their own preferences, from now until the end of time, basically. Which is obviously not true, right? Like, people don't even know what's going to have for dinner later tonight. How are they going to know what their preferences for price are going to be in 5 or 10 years? But the idea is that, look, with these sorts of assumptions, markets behave in a certain way and will lead to a competitive, efficient outcome. And what most economists will say, well, look, even if those assumptions aren't perfectly true, it's a pretty good approximation. It kind of gets you there, or people will behave like that most of the time. What behavioral economics does is to say, well, actually, it turns out that it's not really true. We can show through experiments and research, and psychologists have been doing this for decades, and we can actually show that those assumptions don't hold up. In fact, they break down in very specific ways, and that has some impacts on how people make decisions. So a classic example, a traditional economist, the traditional economics view would be to say that a discount and a late fee are effectively economically the same thing, right? Like either you kind of get a discount for paying early, or you're paying a little bit more, like a penalty paying late. Well, economically, it's exactly the same.
Yeah.
But what behavioral economists would say is, well, no, actually, those two things are quite different because of the way that people perceive them and the way that people might behave in response to them. That people might, for example, be much more accepting of a discount because it seems like a positive thing, and be much more kind of resentful of a company that has lower prices but late fees. And these sorts of framing effects can be really, really important, that people don't necessarily look through some of those sorts of things.
Like specifically, we're talking kind of about loss aversion, right? Like people feel the pain way more than they experience the pleasure. Is that kind of what you're touching on?
Exactly. Yeah. So like a loss is more painful than an equivalent gain is pleasurable. It's also about a product that is $40 seems much more attractive when it's like marked down from $80, right? Even though obviously it's the same product, but actually it looks like you're getting a better deal, and it shouldn't matter. Actually, a classic example, which used to drive one of my former colleagues who had a PhD in economics insane. But imagine you wanted to buy a toaster, right? You see it's $100, and you can get it kind of really close, or you can drive for 20 minutes and pick it up for $50. Let's say you're looking at a flat screen TV, big Panasonic flat screen TV. It's got 55 inches, 4K, all that kind of stuff. You find one, it's $1,500. You can pick it up, or you can drive an extra 20 minutes and save $50. So it's $1,450. Would you drive to pick it up? Most people are like, $50. I probably wouldn't do it. Yeah. The thing is, an economist would say, and the economics of that are actually, you're valuing your time in the first scenario at $50 for half an hour, right? It shouldn't matter whether you're saving $50 or $100 or $50 or $1,500. You should, in theory, make the same decision, but obviously we don't, because $50 seems like a big saving on a small product, but it's not that big a saving on a larger product. So those sorts of framing decisions, the way that a decision is presented, can have a really, really big impact on how people actually behave inside and the choices that they make, right? That ultimately this flows through the behavior, and particularly to financial behavior, right? And it can have interesting impacts on the way that we make choices when we buy products, when we think about how to save, how to invest, all those sorts of things.
So it's how it's framed. And I guess on one side you might have a really complicated model that an economist has come up with to determine what the price of something should be based on all that sort of stuff. And then on the other side, you basically have reality, where you have data and you can actually observe people's behavior and then draw conclusions from that, right? So it's a bit more attached to reality, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a big part of our approach, is to actually sort of run experiments and trials and learn a bit more about how people are behaving and see what kind of data is coming through. And that's a big part of the behavioral economics approach has been recently. There've been more and more economists winning Nobel Prizes in economics for this kind of more behavioral approach, to actually say, well, actually, let's test it. Let's see what people do in the real world, and what does that tell us about human behavior and how we should design policies.
Correct. And that whole, going back to the efficient market hypothesis that you touched on before, that, it assumes that people have, perfect access to perfect information in real time. And it also assumes, I guess, that they're rational actors, right? And I guess that whole way of thinking pervades a lot of people's decisions around money as well. Because for the most part, let's say, for example, if somebody is contributing regularly towards some sort of fund, they are dollar cost averaging in, they're buying into that fund no matter what the value of those units are in a day. I guess that's done so on a couple of reasons. Long term, that's probably a good strategy. But also, I guess the assumption is that for that very moment in time, the price for those units equal the intrinsic value, right? And that's kind of
I mean, that's the assumption of the efficient market hypothesis, right? Is that all the information is out there, and it will that the price accurately reflects the fundamentals. And I think, we've seen, I think, some very high-profile cases where that's often not necessarily the case. The market isn't quite as efficient as we think. There's often some contrarian voices. I mean, I'm sure some of your listeners are familiar with I think it was Wirecard in Germany, the big company that turned out that its profits for the last 4 years just didn't exist, it seems. So the markets aren't necessarily always efficient, but I mean, we sort of have to approach these sorts of things as though they sort of are getting close to efficient.
And so tell me then, you mentioned the word nudge before, or nudge economics. Do you want to just describe what that means a little bit more?
Yeah, so I mean, I think nudge is perhaps the kind of the next step of behavioural economics. So the idea behind nudge is essentially, it's a couple of academics, a guy called Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, both US academics, and they said, look, we have, like, they're economists. Richard Thaler is an economist. He won the Nobel Prize for economics very, very recently. And he said, look, we know all this stuff about human behavior, right? Psychologists have been going on about framing effects and loss aversion, all these sorts of things. And we know that policy making at the moment doesn't actually take that stuff into account. When policies are made, it's just sort of, a classic example is such as disclosure in consumer markets, in financial markets. We just kind of assume if you just give people the information, well, they've got it, and that solves the information problem. When in reality, I mean, we know from lived experience that it just doesn't work. I mean, a tiny fraction of people actually read the terms and the conditions and disclosure documents. But anyway, they said, look, we know this stuff about human behavior. So why don't we take what we know about how humans behave and apply it to policies and services that the governments deliver, and actually have a more nuanced understanding and a real world understanding of how policies and behaviors are designed. And they gave the example of like a canteen or like a buffet or a food hall or something where people are going in there. We know that people want to eat healthier, right? Like there are things that if you ask people, they'll generally say they don't want to make healthier choices, but things get in the way. When people are distracted, when people are with others, they make different choices. And so we also know that people will kind of just load up their plate somewhat mindlessly with kind of whatever's there. So why not make it so that the first thing you see when you kind of get your plate is the salads and the healthy food, so you can load up that plate with vegetables. And so that by the time you get to the French fries later on, you don't actually have as much space on your plate, so you're less likely to put it on there. Now, we're not stopping anyone. If people want to just have piles and piles of French fries, go nuts. We're not going to stop you. We're just going to make it a bit easier and design. They talk about choice architecture. Design that choice architecture so it encourages sort of better and healthier choices. And particularly because there's no neutral way of setting this stuff up. It's not like there's a way that isn't, like, you have to put something first. So you might as well do it in a way that encourages better choices. And so that's the idea. They wrote a book called Nudge in about 2008. When David Cameron, who was at the time the UK opposition leader, he sent some of his advisors, I think, to the US to learn more about kind of new ideas coming out, and Nudge was one of them. And they read the book, loved it, gave it to David Cameron. He read it, loved it. I think he assigned it as reading for his MPs over summer one year when he was in opposition. And then when they came to power in 2010, they were a kind of conservative government that is generally non-interventionist, so they didn't want to be making new rules and regulations. It was also still the shadow of the GFC, so they had no money to do lots of things. And so the idea was, look, can we apply a new way of thinking and just design better systems and processes so that we can achieve kind of policy objectives, but do so in a way that is not heavily interventionist, and then still allows people to make their own choices, but actually just encourages and supports them to kind of do things better.
So it's kind of just curating the invisible hand of the economy to a certain extent, or the inverse of that. So it's kind of like walking through a supermarket. You often see the fruit and vegetables, then you've got the meat and the bread, and then right at the very end, they're all the sweets right before you check out, right when you get your guard down, right? And the kids are starting to get ready. So,
absolutely. I mean, the businesses and supermarkets have been doing this for years, and they're light years ahead of I think where governments, well, I mean, I think governments have caught up a little bit, but think about the things that you would get most commonly from the supermarket, typically something like milk and bread, right? Like those are sort of quick stop. Yeah. If you think to the layout of your supermarket, I'm willing to bet pretty much every supermarket you can think of has those two things like totally far away from each other and also very far away from the entrance. The idea being that you kind of have to walk through the supermarket to actually get to kind of those really common items. And so, you might pick up something else, or on your way out, you'll kind of go to the sweets and pick up those sorts of things.
And so I guess the whole nudge thing is not, it's a bit more interventionist, but in a very laissez-faire way, where you still have all the choices, but they're arranged in a predetermined way to optimize the choices, right? So there's a little bit of architecture going on, right? I think you mentioned the phrase choice architecture before.
And I think the idea as well is, this is an interesting sort of philosophical question, but I think those of us in the kind of behavioral insights community would say that a lot of what we do is we try and do it in a way that is ultimately leads to sort of positive social impact. And so in cases where we think there are going to be benefits, so for example, making it easier for people to make healthier choices, or encouraging, more active lifestyles or things like that. It is a tool like any other, and you can use it for good or for evil if you really want. But I think we would sort of say, look, generally, the idea behind nudge and behavioral insights is ultimately using it for public good in some way, and helping people to make better choices for themselves, and the choices that they probably would, if you ask them, probably would want to make in kind of in the abstract.
So another one of the things that, or another one of the programs that Richard Thaler's fingerprint has been on is this Save More Tomorrow program. Do you want to, because that kind of ties in, I guess, some of the choice architecture, and I guess in a sense it's outsmarting the future, it's outsmarting the present self for the future self's benefit to a certain degree. So do you want to tell me about Save More Tomorrow, what that is?
Yeah, absolutely. Save More Tomorrow is an excellent idea that combines a few really powerful ideas in behavioral insights. So the way the study was set up is really interesting. So what happened is people in this company got offered financial advice, and if they didn't choose to take it up, they got offered a chance to join Save More Tomorrow. And what Save More Tomorrow is, I think it's been rolled out quite widely. Millions of people in the US are now on this sort of program through various companies. But basically what happens is you agree to put away a portion of your future pay rises as retirement savings. So if you get a 2% pay rise, you might put in 0.5% of that as like retirement savings, kind of on a recurring basis. So what happens is you don't ever actually see your pay packet go down, right? It's just that it rises by less than it otherwise would have. And what happens is, so as your salary rises, so do your contributions to your retirement. And there's a couple of really powerful things about this. So firstly, it takes advantage of what's known as the default effect, or inertia. Basically, we as humans have a tendency to kind of go with the default. Whatever the default is in a whole host of settings, we will kind of stick with it.
We're an autopilot. Yeah,
exactly. We're absolutely on autopilot. The best example that I always give of this is that, I guess actually in New Zealand, people are back at work and going to the office. So I imagine most people are commuting the same way today as they did yesterday and the day before and the day before that and the week and the month before, basically going back until either you moved house or you changed job, right? Basically, we follow and we stick with the default. And what this does is it uses a one-time decision to set a really smart default. So the default is now anytime money goes, you get a pay rise, a portion of that gets put into your retirement savings on an ongoing basis. The second thing it does is it gets over present bias. So we have a really a strong focus on present costs and present benefits. So we really focus heavily on those sorts of things. So we don't like making decisions that are going to cost us now. We prefer to make the decisions that are going to give us benefits now and have sort of costs later. And so this is a great way of kind of doing that, of overcoming that present bias. And in fact, it's quite interesting. So saving for retirements is a fascinating one. The psychology behind it is really interesting. So you mentioned loss aversion, right? A loss is more painful than a gain is pleasurable. And so saving is effectively kind of a loss, right? You're taking money away from yourself and putting it aside. What's really interesting is that there's some evidence that we almost see our future self as a different person.
Yeah.
So it's like you're literally taking money away from yourself and giving it to someone else. What Save More Tomorrow does is it takes away that present bias, but also takes away that loss. You never actually see your pay packet go down. It just automatically gets stuck away. And so the really kind of, I think, coolest finding from this, or the nice coda to this story, is that after about, I think, 4 years' time, turns out that people who didn't take the financial advice but did take up Save More Tomorrow were actually saving more of their income than people who took up the financial advice.
Okay, and so it's interesting though that if you agree today, almost you're buying into a program, aren't you? You're committing to something that is hardwiring something that will automatically, which doesn't require your active intervention. So it kind of almost relies on one decision that you made, assuming that was a good decision, which it is in this case, and it kind of just does the rest for you. So it kind of outsmarts the present self.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's the kind of thing. It's easier to get people to make a one-off decision than it is to get them to regularly do things. And so finding ways of setting those smart defaults is really, really powerful. So figuring out actually, how do we get people to make just one decision and make it a good one? Yes. And then actually that will kind of get you a lot of those sorts of benefits. And so, in an investing sense, it might be, how do you kind of come up with a good investment strategy? And then it's just about sticking to it, right? It's not about trying to chopping and changing and doing too much. It's actually, just how do you automate the process of putting in a direct debit that just dollar cost averages like $100 a month or something like that, or $100 from every paycheck, and just puts it into maybe an index fund or a managed fund. And you just do that once, and then you don't have to worry about it, and you're not going to, you don't have to remember it. It just kind of automatically does that and builds up over time. And as you said, that sort of, kind of committing yourself to the future is really, really important. I always sort of say, look, the best day to go to the gym or to start eating healthy or to quit smoking is tomorrow, right? Because it's not today, it's in the future, but it is soon enough that you'll kind of reap all the benefits in the future. And so it's finding ways to kind of overcome that difference between sort of, your current self and your future self.
That's right. And I think in the context of New Zealand with KiwiSaver, for example, if you're an employee, you're putting, say, 3% in, that's being matched by your employer, 3%, 6%. Let's say that that's all you did for your entire working life. That'll achieve a good outcome. And hopefully people have done numbers around that to determine whether or not that's appropriate, an appropriate amount in their retirement. But how do you think it would work in practice? And do you, like you mentioned overseas in the US, it's fairly common, but how does it actually work in practice if it is your 401k or KiwiSaver or Super? How does it work?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it usually ends up being at the employer level, because obviously the employer is the one that handles your payroll and your paycheck, right? And so that's the kind of key bit that you have to get at. And I think employers are getting better at this. So in Australia, some of your listeners might be familiar. We have compulsory savings, so called superannuation, which is our version of sort of KiwiSaver essentially. But people have compulsory, it's at the moment 9.5%. And that is kind of managed by the employer and through payrolls and things like that. But one interesting thing that happens more and more is that when people get an annual bonus, for example, a lot of employers will often proactively give their employees the option to say, hey, you've just gotten a bonus, you can put this into your superannuation or a portion of that into your retirement savings effectively. And there's a lot of evidence that shows, when people have done this, that it's a great time to prompt people when they've got a bit of extra cash to think about putting it aside. And so it's probably going to be something where you need to work with employers to set that up. Because there is a bit of complexity around, making sure that the numbers work out and those payments get shifted and allocated in the right way. But I think that's probably the way that it would work. And as I said, I think employers are getting more mindful and better at this sort of thing, particularly around things like bonuses. But you could obviously take that a step up and implement something like Save More Tomorrow.
Yeah, I guess for self-employed people, obviously it's a different kettle of fish altogether. Who's driving that thing? So maybe there's a bit more work that providers need to actually put into this as well to an option where there's some sort of accelerating payment, which they can opt in and out of to some degree. So tell me a little bit about some of the work that you've done, Ravi, with telecommunications, because I think there's some interesting parallels that we can draw with the telecommunications or the energy space and financial services, or in particular.
Some of the work we've done in telecommunications in New Zealand, we did some work where we looked at what are some of those behavioural biases that affect consumers in the telecommunications market. It was some work we did for the Commerce Commission here, just a kind of a review of the academic and policy literature. And as you say, you're absolutely right. I mean, the kind of principles apply more broadly to how kind of consumers behave in all sorts of markets. And so, we've already kind of touched on some of those things. So defaults are really, really powerful. People don't change telco providers as much as they should. People don't change energy providers, insurance companies, all sorts of things as much as they should. And but the kind of flip side is, if you can, from an investing perspective, if you can make a good decision once, kind of lock in that decision, that default effect can be really, really powerful to kind of drive better outcomes for you and for yourself.
Yeah.
We sort of also talked about some of those sort of framing effects, that the way that choices are set up actually really affect what you're likely to choose.
Because that is quite intriguing, right? Because you would assume, and again, leaning on, I guess, the traditional school of thought, you would assume that the more choices that are out there, people are smart people. Surely they're going to find the most rational, the most optimized choice, and they're going to select that. But in the area of telecommunications and in power companies in general, there's just choices for Africa, right? So tell me what you think about in that space.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. I mean, the short answer is kind of more choices and more complexity doesn't necessarily lead to better outcomes. In fact, for example, in energy markets, there's some academic research that suggests that in places where there are more energy companies and more plans available, people actually make worse decisions. It gets harder for consumers to make a good decision. Actually, some people, when they switch, they're more likely to switch to a worse alternative. And so actually, it's really hard for people to make these sort of choices. And part of it is because, people, it's hard to make a decision across multiple different axes. And if you think about, say, a telecommunications plan, where you might have some included data, you might have a price, you might have some amount of calls that are standard. There's lots of different sort of axes along which you can choose. And it's hard for people to kind of weigh those things up. And so what people end up doing is they'll try and sort of collapse that decision down to like one axis and choose on that. So they might say, look, I just care about having at least 10 gigs of data a month, and then I'll take whatever plan gives me the cheapest version of that, which may or may not be actually the best choice for what you need. It may actually be that, a plan that has 8 gigs of data, but actually costs you, a little bit less, and the extra charges are actually pretty minimal. You'd actually be better off on that plan. But that's how people make decisions. And so what can often be helpful in this space is for policymakers to find a way to kind of help with that. So in energy, for example, a good thing to do is to give people sort of a single figure, like an estimated annual bill, right? To say, look, this is roughly what it's going to cost once you add in all the, the fees and the charges and the rates and the, discounts and what have you. But that's a way to kind of get around some of those sorts of things. Another really interesting one, and we talked a little bit about sort of framing effects. And again, this is, it shouldn't matter how the choice set is presented, you make the same decision. And the best way, I think, to sort of explain this, is to think about if you've ever, during our younger days, when you're out in the town and you think about like, what's the perfect qualities for a wingman or a wingwoman? It's obviously someone who kind of talks you up and is good for you, but ideally you want them to be attractive, but just slightly less attractive than you, right? You don't want them to outshine you, but you want them to make you look good.
Sounds like a movie I just watched recently, which I don't remember who it was, but they were saying, hey, this is how you do it. And that's exactly what you're talking about. So keep going.
But that's the thing, right? That's what you want from a wingman and wingwoman. You want them to look just less attractive than you so that you look better by comparison. And it happens when we judge products that actually, and again, traditional economics would say it shouldn't matter. In fact, there was I think it's a theory or a particular axiom called the independence of irrelevant alternatives. If you throw in an extra alternative into a choice set, that it shouldn't change people's preferences, but it turns out it does. You can change people's preferences by having things that look better or a bit worse than another one, because it makes something else look relatively better or worse. And so those sorts of effects are definitely used by I think telcos and by all sorts of firms to change products. But also another really interesting one, which I think we didn't touch as much in the telecommunications space, but I think it's quite relevant for your listeners, is what's known as the halo effect or attribution bias. So what this is where judgments about one particular quality spill over to other aspects of that product or thing that you're judging. So the best example I can give you is there's evidence that even experienced investors will do this, where they will rate the quality of a prospectus or a company higher if it is more aesthetically pleasing. So in other words, their judgment about the aesthetics of the prospectus seem to spill over into their judgments about the underlying quality of that company. There's some academics who do some interesting lab studies, even with experienced investors, found that this sort of effect seemed to show up. That a more colourful prospectus or annual report, or a more with more images, tends to lead to a higher likelihood that experienced investors would, at least they state a higher likelihood of investing in that company.
And that's the word that will underline experienced investors, right? Because you'd assume that, oh yeah, that'll just sucker in the dummies, right? But if you're talking about experienced investors, basically what you're saying is that they like the glossy, colorful pictures.
Yeah, I mean, they're human, right? Ultimately, we are individuals and we are humans and we are subject to the same sort of biases. And if you think about, these are people with finance backgrounds and who do look at these sorts of things. And so, even, I'm subject to biases. I mean, I can feel it happening to myself sometimes. And I'm sure, your listeners may well find themselves thinking, realizing situations where these sorts of things have happened to them as well.
That's right. No, it's like that quote from the movie that I can't think of right now. She's hot, so I trust her. What was that movie? I don't know what that movie is,
I think I've heard that quote. I don't remember, but that's a great summary of exactly that problem, right? Like, you can think about it in politics, right? We often kind of judge the quality of a leader. I know it's a thing in Australia, and I think in New Zealand as well, that whether you kind of want to have a beer with them is kind of used as a shorthand for how trustworthy and reliable and how good a politician they are, which is not at all the same thing, right? The skills you need to run a country are obviously very different to the skills you need to.
You're spot on. Like, it's like, if they have good teeth, I trust them. I suspect that's probably a bias inside of me, right? Like, I look at their teeth. It makes them, I don't know, subconsciously I'm making some decisions that the better the teeth, the better the upbringing, maybe they're smarter and they're, I can trust them. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I mean, I would say one thing that, these sort of behavioral biases, there's a sort of, sometimes there is a discussion or kind of commentary that these are, irrational biases. And I think it's worth pointing out that the best analogy I can think of is, it's like, when you see those optical illusions where there's like two lines and they look like they're different lengths but they're the same, or they're like the image is moving but obviously it's totally static. And the reason that happens is because your eyes, or like the part of your brain that deals with visual stuff, uses a whole bunch of shortcuts to kind of get through the day, right? There's a massive amount of visual information coming in, and it just kind of cuts down a lot of that and does some sort of shortcuts to help you process it. On the whole, your eyes, you don't run into things, right? For the most part, your eyes work pretty well. It's just that there are certain little things you can do to kind of exploit those shortcuts. And I think that's the same thing with a lot of these behavioral biases. On the whole, the default or the inertia effect isn't necessarily a bad thing. I mean, if you had to, reevaluate every single choice you make every single day, I mean, you'd go insane, right? There's very good reasons for these. Most of the time, the default effect works. It's just that sometimes it can get you into a little bit of trouble, right? And it's simply like the halo effect. If you go to a store and it looks clean and it's been around for a while and the staff look professional, that's usually a good sign that it is it's a decent store. It's not going to be dodgy. And so that mental shortcut works usually. It's just that it can kind of trip you up sometimes. You need to be aware of when it's coming into play and when you need to kind of ignore that sort of that bias.
And there's the issue, I guess, right? And especially when it comes to building wealth or health or wealth, I guess these tools can be used to, for lack of a better term, trick us to make a certain choice that actually benefits the supplier of that rather than us. They use glossy young photos of people, and that that appeals to a certain set that they're trying to attract, and bam, off you go. Like, that's on the negative side. But on the positive side, I guess, and this is where you loop in the whole policy initiatives, the more you acknowledge reality, and human behavior is a big part of reality, whether it's rational or not, the better you can engineer systems and choices so that people make optimal outcomes, right?
Absolutely. And that's the heart of what nudge economics is about. This is the heart of what behavioral insights is about, that you can use it both ways. And indeed, corporations and firms have been using it to their benefit for a long time. So it's kind of, it's incumbent on governments to use it for citizens' benefits and in ways that actually make it easier for people to kind of live their lives and to achieve the kind of goals and outcomes that they want to achieve, and have those kind of good positive outcomes.
Cool. And so obviously data plays a really important role, and I guess going forward, the more that the data set gets filled out, the more data there is available to actually observe what choices people actually make, the easier it would be for those in this space to actually design things to lead to optimal outcomes. I guess what I'm saying is behavioral economics as a general school, is that kind of increasing and leveraging off of more data to kind of becoming more and more of a primary voice out there? Like, what's the future of behavioral economics, I guess is what I'm asking.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think data is a big part of what we do. And I think the other, obviously, one thing that we brought was bringing in thinking about human behavior into public policy. But the other thing that I think that the Behavioural Insights team did that was relatively radical was actually using kind of rigorous evaluations and randomized control trials in evaluating our policy. So when we actually did things, we didn't just sort of do it and say, great. We actually put in a really rigorous evaluation, which was similar to the way that clinical trials are run. Everyone's paying a lot of attention to the clinical trials that are ongoing right now. And the way the clinical trial works is, you get a group of people, a group of patients, half of them, or you randomly allocate some of them to get the new drug, and the other half get a placebo, essentially. Now, in a policy perspective, that might just be half the people get the new policy, half people get kind of current policy, and you see what are the difference between the two. And the idea is that through randomization, we get rid of any kind of, overcome any variance between the two groups, and we can be kind of confident that the differences, any differences we see, are because of the intervention, the new policy that we put into place. And obviously data plays a really big role in that, right? Like, you need to know what the outcomes are. You have data on that sort of thing to actually be able to determine whether or not that's effective. And I think that's probably the second step for us, is to build in more use of those trials and more use of data to really understand what's going on. And then, looking at data, say, okay, what are people doing? How are they behaving? Where could we potentially make some of these choices and changes? And, in the first kind of wave or phase, whatever you want to call it, we were often working within existing systems, just saying, well, what data have you got? Where can we measure outcomes? But I think looking forward, it's going to be about, okay, let's start trying to build systems that actually measure the outcomes that we want, or that we're interested in, that we care about, whether that's financial or health or things like that. And then let's start tracking them and seeing what's happening and how are people behaving at the moment, and are there things we could do to make that easier? So, let's start looking at things like, what are the flows into Kiwis? Or what are kind of consumers, what are people doing? Do we see a spike around the time that, people get bonuses? Do we see, different groups behaving differently? Are there times in people's lives when they start thinking about it? Can we use those moments to actually, reach out to people and to guide them to make a sort of one-off choice that improves their outcomes?
Yeah, because it seems like, I guess you could apply this in almost any discipline, whether it's health or wealth or whatever, relationships. There's the theory of what should work well, best practice, and then there's the reality of what actually works well, and there's a gap in between those things. And my gut feel is that gap is narrowing over time, potentially thanks to just the rise of information and our ability to actually interpret that and to learn from reality rather than overlay our assumptions onto reality. But my assumption is that, I guess in this whole behavioral economics strand, it seems almost like economics is just finding itself rather than it's evolving into something else. It's actually probably just coming back to the purest definition of what it is, right?
I think that's right. Yeah, like, I think that what you said is exactly accurate. That gap between kind of theory and reality is sort of closing. And I think one of the things that you're seeing more and more is, I remember there was an academics that I've heard speaking about this, who I forget his name, but he's a US academic who was talking about how when he started his career in, I think, the 90s, that field experiments in economics were seen as like this kind of weird freak thing that only the kind of the absolute crazy edges of economics got into. Whereas now it's all about kind of actually let's test stuff in the field. Let's sort of look at what works. I think the sort of gap between theory and reality is starting to close, in part because I think the theories have been updated to reflect what happens in reality, right? And so I think the work of economists, of psychologists, and some of the work that the Behavioural Insights team has done kind of across the world has helped to update some of that theory of human behaviour by sort of saying, well, actually, here's some, we've taken what the academics say and we put it into the real world, and we got kind of these results, and some of that confirms the theory, and some of that actually maybe adds something new or something different. So some of the work that we do, actually, our team has published quite a few papers in academic journals to sort of feed back into that theory to try and, as you said, close that gap between theory and reality.
I guess, like from my perspective, sitting in front of people, often I'm talking about financial decisions that they're making, and I absolutely, I can tell you a whole bunch of stories about how sometimes people do get completely bamboozled by choice. Some people do, make not so good decisions because of all the options are in front of them, all the information is given to them, but no advice has been given to them. And so I'm quite interested in this space because I think that there's something in it for everyday investors that are looking to actually, I guess, get a strategy that's going to work for them. Because I don't know if all of that information is in one place. I don't think that there's just a website that people can go to. Well, there is, to get a whole bunch of information. There's lots of websites, but there's not a website that will tell people what is the answer for them to do it. But the answer probably lies within the crowd to a certain extent, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you kind of hit on a really interesting point, which is that people want, we respond better to information that is salient to us. And so we don't want just kind of anything. We want something, oh, that's great, that's good advice, but how does it apply to me? My situation is, X, Y, Z. And it's a really interesting thing because, in some respects, we want something tailored to us, quite specific for us. And we think we're all kind of quite special and quite weird in our own way. In reality, actually, it's probably, there are only about sort of maybe 10 or 20 different sort of sets of advice you probably need to give out. And you could probably capture the vast majority of the market with maybe even less than that, right? But people still feel like they're special and there's something unique about their circumstances that changes things up. And they want something that is relevant to them, which, and rightly so, right? And so finding a way to give that sort of more tailored information, but still at scale is a real challenge. Like, how do you, take these kind of general principles but tailor them to people in specific circumstances based on a few kind of criteria? And I think that's perhaps the next big step, is thinking about how do we create, a lot of our work initially has been sort of, here are two things, a new policy and the old policy, and testing the effectiveness of that. The next step, I think, is going to be actually how do we start to make more tailored things? So actually, there are sort of actually maybe 8 or 10 different outcomes you can have depending on what bucket you fall into, and that is the policy that you'll get. And so from an advice perspective, it might be something like, can we get people to sort of self-select and say, well, I'm married, I have kids, I have a mortgage, or I'm currently renting, and I'm single. What is the financial advice that's right for me at this point? And can we somehow do that at scale? I think that's a really, really big challenge. And
it's a filter, isn't it? Like, you kind of, this is who you are. Therefore, you probably don't need to listen to this, and this. You're kind of just removing some of the noise so that what you do talk about is way more, important, right?
Yeah, exactly. And there's an interesting question of, like, that kind of goes back to the thing we were discussing earlier, right? Like, how much do we want to, how much of a balance there between kind of getting people to make a decision once and kind of locking that in and just setting that to go, but recognizing that actually, when you're talking about someone's working life of 30, 40 years, there are going to be changes and things like that. And so maybe we need to think about when do we get people to re-engage? What are some good points? What are some ways to get people to say, well, you've been on this path for 10 years and that was working great when you were in this situation, but actually now your situation's changed. Do you want to, should we think about a different process, and how do you re-engage people?
That's right. It's a destination with waypoints along the way. And sometimes people don't want to be engaged. And I guess it's like, when you're in the advice space, I guess, even if you were a doctor, for argument's sake, and you wanted to check in with your patients regularly to see how their medication was being handled and all that sort of stuff. You've got this inertia where they might feel like they're okay, therefore they don't want any advice. But you, as the healthcare professional, probably do know that, hey, there's actually some new medicine, there's some new thought in this area, and you want to impart that to them. You want to have some dialogue, but often there's inertia or the unwillingness for people to actually review their situation. Hence the importance to rely on these preset formulas like save more tomorrow, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, actually the sort of, you've raised a really good point about thinking about how to re-engage. The one thing that might work, and so there is evidence that again, time in theory is like, it's linear. It shouldn't matter when things happen, but it turns out that we do have very different perceptions of time based on arbitrary markers like the start of a new year or birthdays, anniversaries, start of a month, things like that. So there's a lot of examples of this that so a classic one is the fresh start effect. So there's some evidence that a new year, a birthday, start of a month is often seen as a chance for like a fresh start, like a chance to re-engage with things. And so the kind of, there's evidence for things like gym memberships go up in the start of January. People are more likely to do those sorts of things. If you look, there's a couple more amusing ones that I like to point out. So if you're going to, there's a thing called Google Trends, where you just kind of can see the interest in search terms over time. I always like to put up the chart of the Google Trends for the word diet. And what you'll see is this like massive spike in January, and it just sort of tails off throughout the year and like plunges in December and then spikes again every January. And the other one that I like to kind of quote, actually, I'll see if you know the answer to this. Do you know what the busiest day for online dating, the busiest day in the year for online dating is?
Well, it's got to be Valentine's Day, right? Surely.
No. So it turns out the busiest day for online dating is the first Sunday after New Year's.
The first Sunday.
So it is. So what happens is, so on online dating, I mean, internet traffic in general, behaviors often follow this pattern where like it spikes around Sunday, sort of drops off, and then people, Thursday, Friday, Saturday is low, and then jumps up again on Sunday. So basically people kind of go on and find their dates on Sunday, Monday, and they go out and have very disappointing dates on Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and then jump back on Sunday. And so, what's happening is obviously Sunday's a busy day for online dating, and then after New Year, people are like, all right, time for a fresh start, time to get back on the wagon. And so, the kind of, I like to point this out.
The partner after the Christmas dinner. Right, I'm over that guy.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I shouldn't joke. I met my wife through online dating, so it definitely does have success stories. But
I'll check in with you after New Year's next year. We'll see how you feel.
But I think that there is a really serious point to that, which is that, look, we can think about using some of those moments of change as an opportunity to drive behavior. And again, I mean, I talked a little bit earlier. I think that we don't change our travel patterns unless we kind of change jobs or we change house. Moving house is a really big transition point. So those are chances to kind of lock in new behaviors. So can we think about, are there those big moments of change out there where we can prompt people? Changing jobs is a pretty big one, right? Like, is that an opportunity for us to sort of say to people to reach out to them? I mean, it might be one for say, KiwiSaver funds to actually think about. I mean, they'll see if money starts coming in from a different place, presumably, or a salary change. Be like, hey, seems like you've changed jobs. Have you considered reviewing your investment strategy or things like that? That could be an opportunity to actually intervene and to get people to kind of reset and rethink.
Yeah. Wow, man, Ravi, you're a smart guy. I could probably have a chat with you for a hell of a lot longer than that. I think we probably better wrap it up for today. So maybe if you could just I know that me personally, I've really benefited from understanding a little bit more and learning a little bit more about the work that Richard Thaler has done. Mm-hmm. And that book, Nudge, and I'm pretty sure it's called Misbehaving is his more recent book, but I'll double check that. Is there any other kind of resources or places that you could point our listeners to in terms of understanding more about, say, nudge economics or behavioral economics in general?
Yeah. So, I mean, if you're interested in, I guess, contemporary kind of policy applications and how it's going on, so our website is bi.team. We've got a blog. Team, bi.team, very, very simple. Seems to throw people a little bit, but trust me, it works. So, I mean, there's a blog there where we talk about all sorts of kind of ways that we've been applying it to, not just financial behavior. So we have got, I think, on our blog a story about some work we've done, kind of getting people to think more about taking out advice for pensions, but health, education, all sorts of things. If you're interested in behavioral economics, I think if you just Google behavioral economics guides, there is a really great website that puts out a guide every year on just basic concepts and what's happened in the field and further resources. That's probably really good if you're interested in that. But as I think Nudge and Misbehaving are great starting points. The other great interesting book to read is Thinking Fast and Slow by a guy called Daniel Kahneman. So that's a little bit older, and there have been some changes to the research since then. But I mean, that's also another. I mean, so Daniel Kahneman also won the Nobel Prize for economics a while ago, despite being a psychologist. He sort of did a lot of the foundational studies that showed, I think, a lot of these effects. So those are great places to sort of get started and learn more about behavioral economics.
It's such an important field, because I think most people, when they think about money, they think that it's just a small part of their life. It's the money part of their life. But really, with investing, or almost with anything to a certain extent, you're bringing all of yourself to that which you're engaging with. So if you leave your psychology behind, where's the wisdom in that, right? You got to bring it with you.
Absolutely. I mean, ultimately, a lot of the decisions we make are about behavior, right? Like, do I go out and exercise? What do I have for dinner? What do I buy at the supermarket? What sort of products do I buy? Lots and lots of decisions we make are about behavior. And so understanding how we make decisions is really, really important. And as I said, just because you know all these biases doesn't mean you're not going to still get caught out by them. I definitely get caught out by them.
That's right.
This day, and I've been working for half a decade in this field. But it is really helpful for you to understand and to think about what choices you're making, and to think about ways of even protecting yourself, I guess, and think about how do I set myself up so that I set up a good default for myself once, and I don't have to come back to that decision again and again.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thanks again, Ravi, and we will catch you next time around, eh?
You're very welcome. It's been an absolute pleasure being on your show.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.